The death of Grendel, and honestly, the following scenes of Beowulf's coming back to deliver the news and be thanked, uh, generally marks a traditional transition point in the poem. Different critics have different ways of assessing the poem and breaking it down into chunks. The one that marks the one that's gotten the most play in the last half century or so has been, or the last century, honestly, has been the criticism of the author J.R.R. Tolkien, who, in addition to the Lord of the Rings, was a very well entrenched scholar of Old English and Beowulf in particular. His translation of the work actually was just published very recently. He translated it, oh God, sometime in the early 30s, I think. And he just stuck it in a drawer and it sat there. And it was only a few years ago that his son dug it out and published it. So he was deeply embedded in this literature to begin with, but he wrote a very famous essay, or technically he delivered it as a lecture. He wrote he did a lecture called what is it? Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, where he took to task the whole tradition of Beowulf scholarship that focused too much, he felt, on the history that it offered, the glimpse into those murky historical periods when the Norse tribes of Northern Europe were fighting one another and slowly making their way over to the English, to England, and he was frustrated by that because of the lack of truth or the lack of verifiable information that the poem offered in that regard, but also that these critics who were doing this just completely blew over the idea that this was a poem, and his concern was that looking to it for historical rather than aesthetic purposes really missed the point, that the poem was, by the way it was organized and the way it expresses itself, just as coherently poetic and artful as the Iliad and the Odyssey and other works to which he felt it bore comparison. And he could be quite funny in that. One of my favorite little passages of this essay, I gotta say, included in this. But it is plainly only in the consideration of Beowulf as a poem, with an inherent poetic significance, that any view or conviction can be reached or steadily held. For it is of their nature that the jabberwocks of historical and antiquarian research burble in the tulgey wood of conjecture, flitting from one tum-tum tree to another. Noble animals, whose burbling is on occasion good to hear, but though their eyes of flame may sometimes prove searchlights, their range is short. That is him on his fellow academics and scholars. Critics. Whether you like the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit or any of that stuff, that one, I think that's only like 2 or 3 sentences. Those 3 sentences earn him a place in literary fame. My contention, however, is that while there is a lot of aesthetic value there is a great deal of beauty, of passion, of power packed into this poem. It also has an historical agenda. and the interplay of those two is significant as far as I'm concerned. It aids one another, the historical and the aesthetic. These two agendas aid one another in proving the worth of this as a text, honestly, as something that is worth digging into. Old English has very few adherents these days. There is not a lot of there are not a lot of departments of Old English in most colleges these days. Finding anyone who can read the original is very difficult. But that doesn't mean that we should all let it fall away. It retains its place in curricula of the modern era because England in general and English has a somewhat outsized voice in the world of world literature, and this is a peek into that in a very early stage. But even if all of that was gone, it would still have power. It would still have resonance that is worth digging into. It is very foreign to contemporary audiences, in some ways more foreign than the Iliad and the Odyssey and stuff that is way, way older. There is a unfamiliarity with this culture that makes it sometimes a bit of a slog to get through. But if you just make that investment, if you give yourself over just a little bit, it can start to open up this whole new world that maybe you've never seen, maybe you've never heard of, maybe you've never even thought of, but that has resonances for you, both in the way it is so foreign and cracks open your mind just a little bit to see, wow, that is another way of looking at things, but also that it is so identifiable because it captures humanity in a very close to the bone form. So we can recognize normal human behavior in extraordinary circumstances, which extraordinary circumstances tend to pop up more and more, it seems. So there is, I think, a great value in that. Anyway, we left off. Beowulf had just killed Grendel's mother. He comes back to Heorot, dragging the head of the monster with him. He presents a sword to Hrothgar. That's a fun name to say, Hrothgar. He presents a sword to Hrothgar that he had found there, and in it, the metalwork in it has been very detailed, engraved. There's some very finely detailed engraving and artwork on the weapon. Now remember, weapons are extremely important to these people. This is a warrior culture, so they are very conscious of their weapons, and they decorate them so that there's a personal quality to them. It is very clearly that they valued weapons as more than just, implements of death and destruction and warfare. They had they made a very big deal about handing down weapons from generation to generation, and this was a sense of bringing people together. You gave weapons as gifts to signify a bond. And here, Beowulf, who has killed the monster on behalf of Hrothgar, comes and bestows upon Hrothgar this gift, this sword. The design on the sword is biblical. It's the story of the giants who were the sons of Cain, or the descendants of Cain, who were wiped out in Noah's flood in the early Genesis story. And Hrothgar takes this and he is moved by it. He takes a moment to look at it and is touched. I think it's fair to say. The symbol of giving over the sword, of providing that gift, is a symbol of an alliance forged between these two people who in the past have been rivals, have been enemies at times. But the presenting of this gift has significance. It is a sign of some touching quality. It showed how war first came into the world, and the flood destroyed the tribe of giants. They suffered terrible severance from their war, from their lord. A interesting severance is another interesting suggestion of division being something painful. Hrothgar is looking at it, considering the pure gold inlay on the sword guards. And he makes this very famous speech. It is referred to afterwards as Hrothgar's sermon by some. It is at times it might seem ironic, and at times it might be, but it also has this thoughtful and very sincere quality. It begins, "A protector of his people, pledged to uphold truth and justice and to respect tradition, is entitled to affirm that this man was born to distinction. Beowulf, my friend, your fame has gone far and wide, you are known everywhere. In all things you are even-tempered, prudent, and resolute, so I stand firm by the promise of friendship we exchanged before. Forever you will be your people's mainstay and your own warrior's helping hand." Now, there's a lot in that. I mean, again, irony, you could say a protector of his people pledged to uphold truth and justice and to respect tradition. Who is he talking of there? You got to get to the middle of the sentence before you realize that he's talking about himself. Is there irony there? Is there self-acknowledgement there? Is there a sense of vulnerability there? Because he is the king who for years now has been letting Grendel and then Grendel's mother just lay waste to his kingdom. And it takes Beowulf coming in to save the day. And they've had this somewhat cautious rivalry going ever since. Hrothgar is much older, Beowulf is still a young man here, but there's a bit of a power struggle between them. Or I don't know if struggle is the word, but a power dynamic where they're trying to find their respective identities in relation to one another. And I think that line, just the way it's phrased, where he begins by describing the notion of a king, the ideal leader, a protector of his people, shows a certain self-awareness of that. But also just the items that he ticks off there. Again, as a king, you can list any number of attributes, and the poet certainly could have named many, many, many of them. But the ones that he picked up, a protector of his people, clearly this is meant to shift you into that somewhat uncertain mode of interpreting this. Pledged to uphold truth and justice and to respect tradition. To respect tradition. This is interesting because in describing the ideal king, he is emphasizing that one of his primary jobs here, the first one he can really think of after protecting his people, is to respect tradition. The traditions most explicitly of truth and justice in a society, but here he is being confronted with this new element in society who's coming along with some very different ideas about how things should be done. And Hrothgar has been uncertain about this from the start, but he sees his role as to protect tradition here. It's a conservative pitch to say, okay, you, Beowulf, are new, and we're going to have to deal with you and your ideas, but it is my role to slow them down a little bit, to try and find a respectful melding of the old and the new. And that balance is very important in the role of a king. In all things, you are even-tempered, prudent, and resolute. These are qualities that the Greeks would appreciate. So I stand firm by the promise of friendship we exchanged before. So here you've got a sense of another almost transactional reference where he is leaning on, well, we agreed. We have a contract that said we would be allies from now on, and I'm going to honor that. There's another sense of that transactional nature that Beowulf seems to be almost a challenge to, because they have yet to really figure out what this guy wants. Forever you will be your people's mainstay and your own warriors' helping hand. So again, he's sort of pushing him back and saying, okay, you're for your people. My people are my concern, yours are your concern. So there is that immediate beginning where he's distancing Beowulf just a little bit from the Spear Danes, from saying, it was very nice that you came, your job is done, that's it. But it's not really, he's not being so ungrateful. He's just trying to establish the proper diplomatic boundaries to their relationship, I would say. So learn from this and understand true values. I who tell you have wintered into wisdom. I love that phrase, wintered into wisdom, saying I'm old now and I've been around, I've learned a few things. So, listen to what I have to say for a minute. It is a great wonder how the Almighty God in his magnificence favors our race with rank and scope and the gift of wisdom. His sway is wide. Sometimes he allows the mind of man of distinguished birth to follow its bent, grants him fulfillment and felicity on earth, and forts to command in his own country, which is an interesting little description of free will. Sometimes God lets a king or a commander make his own choices, make his own decisions, pursue his own agenda. He limits him to lord it in his many lands until the man in his unthinkingness forgets that he will never end for him. He permits him to lord it. Okay, so God gives you the scope to act on your own, to exercise free will in your own lands, until that man forgets that it will ever end for him. So this is a memento mori, would be the Latin term, a reminder that you're not going to be young forever. Don't be foolish. Don't believe that you are invincible. Old age comes for us all. Death comes for us all. And let that be a check on your free will within the boundaries of your country, which is what he's describing here. He is, again, focusing on the diplomatic relationship between these two peoples, between these peoples that have a history of antagonism and are now going into a somewhat uncertain alliance. They're figuring their way forward. And so here, Hrothgar is just trying to lay down a predicate of, let's all stay within our own lanes for now. We're going to be friends, but let's not get too, let's not push beyond natural boundaries. The whole world conforms to his will, talking about the young ruler, conforms to his will, he is kept from the worst until an element of overweening enters him and takes hold, while the soul's guard, its sentry, drowses, grown too distracted, which is something the Greeks would recognize. His fellow pagans, pagan ancestors perhaps, who warned so much about hubris. Remember to be humble in your perspective. And then he goes a little bit further with this notion of the sentry, the soul's guard, its sentry, drowsing. He talks about a killer stalks him, an archer who draws a deadly bow. And then the man is hit in the heart, the arrow flies beneath his defenses, the devious promptings of the demons start. The demon. Here we're talking, we have left the classical world of the Greeks, and here we are four square in the world of the Christians. And the demon is Satan in this, and a major tenet of Christian tradition at this time, basically taking it from Augustine. Augustine's doctrine warned of Satan is always looming. Satan is always there. The devil awaits unless you are ever vigilant against him. So here, when you see those same terms, when the soul's guard, its sentry, drowses, grown too distracted, you can lose your awareness of Satan's predatory nature, and Satan will infect you, essentially, if you let down your guard. So he is imploring Beowulf to seek out the good, to choose the good, use that free will to avoid the devil's influence, to practice humble, virtuous leadership. This is one older leader to another one who is on the rise. Beowulf is just basically a noble soldier from a foreign land, but clearly Hrothgar is saying, all right, this guy could be going somewhere, so let me just try and plant the seed of wisdom in him now while it can still make a difference. O flower of warriors, beware that trap. Choose, dear Beowulf, the better part, eternal rewards. Do not give way to pride. Eternal rewards. Right there is a very explicit Christian reference saying, go for heaven, is the implication. And this is a curious command or bit of advice from Hrothgar, who has thus far been more of he credits God an awful lot. He does so right here. He gives credit to God first. So I praise God in his heavenly glory that I live to behold his head dripping blood, and that after such harrowing I can look upon it in triumph at last. That is his credit for the murder of the monsters. He's again crediting God and referencing himself, again sort of excluding Beowulf and Beowulf's actions from the picture, but he is in a way a voice of tradition. The tradition is pagan. The tradition that they have been living with is pagan, and he is here trying to find ways to find a productive weaving of these two traditions together, the pagan and the Christian. How do we fit them together? And in a way, his constant negotiation with Beowulf is that process of coming up with room for the old and the new in something that is a weaving of both rather than a conquering of one or the other. The belief that these two traditions, the old and the new, can come together and be something more than they would be individually, which is what you would have if one were to conquer the other, which is, you can go crazy with interpreting that. And he ends this speech, always look at endings, beginnings and endings. Take your peace then with pride and pleasure and move to the feast tomorrow morning. Our treasure will be shared and showered upon you, which is another reference to the transactional relationship that they have. He has spent a fair amount of time in this speech throwing shade at the whole idea of money and treasure and material rewards. So now he's basically saying, you know, money is worthless, but that's all I'm giving you, which is awkward. But it's also a sense, there's another sense in there of treasure will be shared. And if you look at the treasure metaphorically, the treasure is not just, you know, a pot of gold, so to speak, or even you know, as it will be here, a small armory of heavily decorated and precious metal weapons. But the treasure is an earthly treasure. It is a metaphorical treasure of shared culture. Theirs is a warrior culture. The weapons are a symbol of that, and they are going to share something. It's not going to necessarily be given one to the other or transferred. It's going to be something that is shared. I think that word is very important here. That notion that it is not about transferring from one thing to another, but rather bringing those two things together. Because again, the weapons are seen as as heirlooms, as a heritage that passes on from one to the other. And anybody who has a sword will be able to say, well, yes, my great-grandfather won this in a battle from somebody in a distant land, and he recalls that history of it, and he sees it as a bond between him, not only himself, and that grandfather, that great-grandfather, whatever, across generations, but also across space, where he sees it as a bond with the people he got it from. There is a real sense of material possessions having a conjoining effect throughout the culture. Beowulf returns home. He gets he takes off from the Spear Danes. He remarks the alliance. Now we who have crossed the wide sea have to inform you we feel a desire to return to Helak, the king, and he states the new alliance. He remarks that okay, we're friends now. We're no longer enemies. We're no longer rivals. We can act with some confidence in that relationship. Hrothgar agrees. Credits God again. The Lord in his wisdom sent you those words. You know, Beowulf he's a big boy. He can speak for himself, but Hrothgar is saying, no, it's not you. It's God. Which is a reminder of humility, but also a little undercutting, little shade there. But Hrothgar notes, what you have done is draw two peoples, the Geat nation and us neighboring Danes, into the shared peace and a pact of friendship. So they're recognizing that this action wasn't just a mere transaction, that it wasn't just about, well, you came, you killed some monsters, we're going to pay you, you go home, but that it has brought them closer together in a kind of communion, a kind of shared experience, a shared bond that they can rely on going forward. They're no longer just two tribes, you know, looking to snipe at one another, but they now have a bond of humanity. A bond of humanity that they can rely on in the future when, you know, there's always a a risk that war is going to break out, that something's going to happen, that it will be tested in the future, these bonds. So reminding one another repeatedly that, okay, we're friends now. That's important because those bonds in an uncertain, very violent world, those bonds can be tested. So he goes home. You get another lovely little speech about the journey and the sailing, and you're reminded that, oh yeah, okay, these are sailors. Then the keel plunged and shook the sea. They sailed from Denmark. Right away the mast was rigged with its sea shawl. Sail ropes were tightened, timbers drummed, and stiff winds kept the wave crosser skimming ahead. As she heaved forward, her foamy neck was fleeked and buoyant, a lapped prow loping over currents, until finally the Geats caught sight of coastline and familiar cliffs. The keel reared up, wind lifted it home. It hit on the land. If you've ever been on a boat, you can appreciate just the beauty of that moment, just that enthusiasm for the mere act of movement over water. The surge, the excitement, the power you feel underneath you, lifting you up, and the threat of it being always able to crush you and swallow you at a moment's notice. But it's also the spirit of adventure, the spirit of journeying. He comes home, he tells his story, recounts his tale to Helak. He has gifts to give out. He he's assessing the political situation because he's been away for a little while. He talks about the past is always a prologue to the future, and there are always stories of these little family battles and these rivalries within families, which is just a metaphor for rivalry within tribes, between nations, and he's he is presenting Helak with the rewards of what he has earned there. Helak rewards Beowulf as well, and the battle-famed king, bulwarker of his earls, ordered a gold-chased heirloom of Hrethel's, which is his, actually his and Beowulf's ancestor, to be brought in. It was the best example of a gem-studded sword in the Geat treasury. This he laid on Beowulf's lap. Again, that rewarding with weaponry as heirloom, as history, as a tie across time and space. Then you get a little bit of a time jump. The Greek tradition, begun by Aristotle, of unity of time is pretty sharply violated here. The Greeks like to have everything, well, we need to know that roughly everything happens in a normal spate of time. So they don't like flashbacks in general or anything like that, but especially, big leaps in time where it'll be uncertain what happens. And here, they suddenly leap forward 50 years. Nothing. It's a bat of an eye. And Beowulf is now an old man, a very old man. He is now the king of the Geats. Helak had in time, of course, passed. Helak's son ascended to the throne, but there were some problems there, and he was ultimately killed in battle. Beowulf was made king in pretty quick succession. Where it seems to be something done almost by popular acclamation, where they just said, well, okay, he is clearly the best one. Um, and then this little image of peace is disturbed because the wide kingdom reverted to Beowulf. He ruled it well for 50 winters, grew old and wise as warden of the land. Peace, tranquility, aging, until one began to dominate the dark, a dragon on the prowl from the steep vaults of a stone-roofed barrow where he guarded a hoard. It's an interesting little jump here, where you have Beowulf singled out as, well, okay, things went well for him. He got old and, old and comfortable. He was wealthy. He was a king. He was widely respected. All this will become clear soon enough. But just in the bare details that we know now, he became king. He ruled for 50 years of uh, wise rule, at least. He grew old and wise as warden of the land. He ruled it well. So you get the sense that things have been going well. Later on, we'll learn that, okay, those 50 years were pretty much 50 years of peace. He didn't really go to war. In a warrior culture, he kept the peace. He is something very new. But right now, just that sense of, things are going well. Not too many details. Perhaps he's getting used to it. 50 years, you can get a little lax. And when you are lax, we have been told by Hrothgar, that's when the devil awaits. That's when evil lurks at the door. Genesis. But suddenly we have a dragon. This dragon is an interesting character. It will be developed more throughout. But right away, we're presented with this dragon arising in a time of peace and prosperity. So the reference to the devil at the door, the devil, looming, just waiting for the unwary, is lingering in the back of the head as we get to him here, and just think about it in simple simple imagery. I mean, a lot of the imagery of Dungeons and Dragons and all of that stuff begins here. This is thought to be the first real instance of a dragon, a fire-breathing dragon, in literature. So we get a lot of that notion of the dragon being the primary foe of knights in shining armor from this. But a dragon is reptilian, which just as a species is about as far from humanity as you can get. Even leaving aside the whole association with the serpent in the Garden of Eden, there is something very foreign about a dragon, something very othered. Grendel and Grendel's mother were monsters, but they seem to have emotional lives. They had hands and arms and shoulders and all of these recognizable parts that we can see as at least a mammal might have. So I've always imagined Grendel and Grendel's mother as sort of like large yeti. And the dragon is something even further removed from humanity. Remember, Grendel and Grendel's mother were described as living alone, as exiles, essentially, far removed on the outskirts of civilization. They were outcasts. And here we get something that seems even further, something even more obscure, even more animal, bestial, I think would be the best word. Um, and that it is also very clearly uh, embracing imagery of Satan. Satan was a vague notion at the time for some, even in biblical studies. But the association with fire, with scales, sometimes a tail, Satan takes on all of these attributes over time, and this is very reminiscent of that. You have like like Grendel and Grendel's mother, the dragon is largely nocturnal. He doesn't. He tends to come out at night, which is again a creepy time, but also a time associated with when the sun is not looking. So when you lower your guard, when you close your eyes, that's when evil strikes. That's when evil lurks at the door. Here, when the sun goes down, the sun, as the eye of the world, closes. That's when evil tends to surface. He is also here mentioned as having one of his most significant attributes. He has a hoard of treasure. He guarded a hoard. And this is something that we saw with Grendel's mother. Not so much Grendel, but Grendel lived there, I guess. Grendel's mother guarded a hoard. She had a lot of treasure that she had accumulated and was not sharing in any way. Treasure we have seen, weapons we have seen, gold and whatever, has been for the Spear Danes, for the Geats, for everyone in this culture, something to be shared. A good ruler shares his treasures. His men bring some to him, he gives it back, which we had just seen with the scene with Helak and Beowulf. The giving back of treasure, the sharing of it, something to be handed back and forth in a sense of creating a bond. And here we have another hoard, which is a creature outside the realm of humanity who doesn't share, who just takes. And that's another sense of his being outside humanity, bestial. He has no. I'm using the pronoun he. I don't know. I didn't look, but the dragon is a thorough negation of humanity. He doesn't look anything like a human being. Doesn't have any interior life that we can tell. He's drawn only in the most sketchy and abstract motivations. Outside of pure greed. And greed is being couched as the antithesis of humanity. So anyway, you get a little story about the how the dragon was first found by this thief, stumbled upon his underground lair, much like the underground lair that we had with Grendel's mom, and tries to steal a goblet. The dragon wakes up, is incensed by this, is furious, and trips into a sudden and devastating rage. The thief, significantly, is an escaped slave fleeing the heavy hand of some master. So again, you get a sense of bad leadership, perhaps, ungenerous leadership. And there's always that element in there. There were many other heirlooms heaped inside the earth house because long ago, with deliberate care, somebody now forgotten had buried the riches of a high-born race in this ancient cache. Death had come and taken them all in times gone by, and the only one left to tell their tale, the last of their line, could look forward to nothing but the same fate for himself. He foresaw that his joy in the treasure would be brief. So we're given this little story of the treasure itself. The treasure was the heritage of some tribe that is now largely extinct, and the dragon essentially, takes it over. But there is a short passage called the Lay of the Last Survivor, where he where this one person who's left on this mound of treasure, the accumulated value of his civilization, and he knows he's going to die. What do you do with that? How do you share it? And there's a sense of real tragedy because he can't. And he gets this little story that he can tell. A newly constructed barrow stood waiting on a wide headland close to the waves, its entryway secured into it. The keeper of the hoard had carried all the goods and golden ware worth preserving. His words were few. Now, earth, hold what earls once held, and heroes can no more. Earls and heroes. And it's coming to nothing, and he's trying to link his culture at least to the earth, which is almost a negative sharing, but it's something. He's trying to give it back to the earth. It's all come to nothing. The value of it is nothing at this point, beyond its symbolic or metaphorical or cultural value, which presumably is going to die with this last survivor. But also it unites the earls and the heroes with posterity, perhaps, but more likely just, the absence of civilization in the earth. It was mined from you first by honorable men. My own people have been ruined in war. One by one they went down to death, looked their last on sweet life in the hall. I am left with nobody to bear a sword or to burnish plated goblets, put a sheen on that cup. Interesting. Nobody to bear a sword, which seemed like a nobleman who would take a sword and bear it forward, like Beowulf bearing forward the sword that Helak had given him, but also to put a sheen on the cup. So you get a sense of the heroes and the servants together in this. So now it's not just time and space that these heirlooms are crossing, but also social divides. They are uniting people across every barrier you can fathom. The companies have departed. The hard helmet hashed with gold would be stripped of its hoops. The helmet shiner, who should polish the metal of the war mask, sleeps. Again, a little attention to the servants there, the helmet shiner. I'm guessing that's not a high-ranking position in society. The coat of mail that came through all fights, through shield collapse and cut of sword, decays with the warrior. All of this notion of, weaponry and the loss, how it's all come to nothing. No trembling heart, no tuned timber, no tumbling hawk swerving through the hall, no swift horse pawing the courtyard. Pillage and slaughter have emptied the earth of entire peoples, which is a weird statement to end his little song with, because he is mourning the loss of his people, and he is recognizing that this all came through warfare. But it's weird that he is blaming pillage, which is, essentially the theft that comes after warfare. That he's blaming that for rendering all of his weaponry useless. which is curious to me. The distance between those two ideas is perhaps greater in the present day than it was in this more ancient warrior ethos. Um, but it's one of those things that just jump out at you and go, well, no, wait a minute, it's the weapons that caused the pillage. Well, no, it's you know, this is a warrior culture. The weapons are an extension of the humanity, not a an instrument of its destruction. Then, of course, after this little song, uh, this sad dirge for his entire culture. Um, the last survivor dies, and then an old harrower of the dark happened to find the hoard open and the burning one who hunts out Barrows the slick-skinned dragon. Slick-skinned, again, very bizarrely bestial, completely foreign to human recognizability. You know, look at a snake. Look at a snake in the eyes, and you have no recognition. You look at a dog, or or any mammal in the eyes, and you can sort of sense that, all right, common ancestor maybe, but a reptile is completely foreign. Um, he rises up. He takes control of uh, the of the horde, and you have the demon jumping in after a recognition that a small race of humanity, a small tribe, who perhaps put too much value on the on accumulating that treasure, is now wiped away. Now you get uh, the rise of Satan. Um, he is uh, he is an example of it says that he guards over heathen gold for roughly 3 centuries, which puts you back in the very late classical era, probably, for this, and and that reference to heathen gold, pagan gold, essentially. So suddenly it's becoming like, well, this is more than just gold. This has some metaphoric value, and it seems to be a repository of everything that was perhaps noble in this perished race. And now you're starting to look back on that last survivor and see, well, maybe it wasn't just one small little culture, but maybe it was a much larger culture. Maybe it was a classical culture of some form, a pagan culture of some form. And the value is still there. It's just that the dragon is now sitting on top of it. The dragon has claimed it. And does it have any utility beyond that? Now that the dragon has it, I don't know. The dragon's not using it. It's non-economic, just like that of Grendel's mom. But there is a sense that it is, because of dwelling on all of the articles, that there is something of great value there. We just have to reclaim it, perhaps. Um, so Beowulf hears of all of this. The dragon bursts out and starts rampaging, breathing fire across the land, scorching the earth. He destroys Beowulf's home, so it really hits very personally to him at that point. And he comes up with the plan, okay, I have to go fight this dragon. Now, he is somewhere north of 80 years old at this point. He is an old man. It is uh, he has a sense of his death being foretold already, being destined. You get a sense of a pagan destiny that's still there, that belief in, it is my fate that the pagans hung to so closely. Um, he goes around and he gathers up 12 comrades, 12 soldiers who will help him with this. He has a very touching scene where he goes to a hilltop and just takes a moment, and you get a real sense that, okay, he's saying goodbye to the world. Um, he is. Where'd he go? Where'd he go? Where'd he go? Hold on. The veteran king sat down on the cliff top. He wished good luck to the Geats who had shared his hearth and his gold. He was sad at heart, unsettled yet ready, sensing his death. His fate hovered near, pagan, unknowable but certain. It would soon claim his coffered soul, part life from limb. Before long, the prince's spirit would spin free from his body, which is interesting in that you're going from, again, this weird two-pronged attack on the philosophy here, where he's talking about fate, this immutable fate that organizes all our lives, which is a relatively pagan notion, and yet he ends with that the prince's spirit would spin free from his body. Which has its precedence in certain pagan cultures, but still the idea of the soul moving on from the body is a core belief of Christianity. So you can see again this weird toggling back and forth, this weaving of these two worldviews. He has he recalls his life story to himself. He recalls some of the political divisions that have cropped up, uh, both in the past and that forebode in the future. Um, he declares, I shall pursue this fight for the glory of winning, which is a little bit uncertain because he didn't seem to be fighting for glory so much with Grendel and Grendel's mother. He did it by his own admission, and you can certainly bake into it because there are enough references to fame and glory and what have you. But there was a sense of more obligation there. Here, he's doing it out of a sense of obligation, I would say, but he makes somewhat more outward show of declaring it for the glory of winning. I'm not sure how that fits in. I haven't really settled in my head yet, but that's a curious little knot in the easy reception of this. Very significantly, as he is suiting up for battle and heading in to go meet the dragon, he tells everyone, all of his comrades, okay, you've all come with me. I'm in my 80s. I'm a fairly old man here, and you're all young, strong warriors. But I tell you what, you just sit. I'm going to go in. He just says, don't bother. You stay behind. I'm going to go do it. He makes the familiar reference to, well, I wish I could do this without weapons even. And, that just sounds insane. But he did, he killed the other two without weapons. Well, he killed Grendel without a weapon and just his bare hands. And he seems to acknowledge that he would like to do that again, but he can't. And right there, you're getting a real sense because within all of these forebodings of death, you're getting a real sense that, okay, he understands he is an old man now. He is on the cusp of death, and if he wants glory, as he says, it is certainly a final glory. You get a real sense that he knows he's not even going to survive this. It's going to be a death battle, and maybe maybe that is his way of going out on top. Maybe it is his way of giving one last gift to his people now that he has nothing else to give. Presumably, he has been and has the reputation for giving out lots of treasure. He has no children to leave anything behind to. The entire nation, conceivably, is his child, and he is going to bequeath to them the gift of ridding the land of this scourge, this dragon. Um, he goes in. Uh, he gave a shout. The Lord of the Geese unburdened his breast and broke out in a storm of anger into this cave, this cavern where he's going to find the dragon. Under the gray stone, his voice challenged and resounded clearly in echo. Hate was ignited. The horde guard recognized a human voice. The time was over for peace and parleying. The dragon is incensed by even the sound of humanity, and that recalls, honestly, the the fact that Grendel was upset because he heard all of the noise in the hall, all of the gaiety, the joy, and the togetherness, and now you have just the sound of this one person, but this hero. So the if Beowulf here represents all that is best in humanity, the apex of humanity, the dragon is its polar opposite. In this little moment, you see just through the association with sound, it is the absolute negation of all of that. It is purely inhuman. Um, but they face off, and it is a titanic, brutal battle. Um, Beowulf's strength is somewhat insufficient. He goes up, and uh, his hand is his hand is too weak, as they say. The blade flashed and slashed, yet the blow was far less powerful than the hard-pressed king had need of it at that moment, which is somewhat sad and pathetic in a pathetic in a empathetic way. It is heartbreaking, but it makes the action itself all the more valid because he is old and he is doing everything he can to stand up for his people, to fight for his people at this point. He is doing what a hero has to. It's one thing when you were the mightiest of the mightiest hero in the land. Uh, it's something else when you're a somewhat frail old man to have that heroism. And it makes me think, honestly, I reflect back on the Iliad when Priam puts on his sword at at the invasion of the Greeks, and he's going to put on his sword when he's barely able to hold it up. He's putting on his armor to go out and fight and die. And there's something, sort of silly about that. And his wife scolds him for it. There's something really quite noble in it. Like, it's what you do when you're a hero. Um, all of his men who are outside hear what's going on out there, and they are much younger, they are much stronger, and they were all handpicked by him, by Beowulf, and yet they hear what's going on and they scatter. They, whoa, what is that? And they just run, 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 run for the bushes, and they're going to hide, which is sad. One of them stands up, a young aide named Wiglaf. Wiglaf um, is outraged that his comrades would abandon their leader, and he reprimands him, and he's sad at heart, addressing his companion. Wiglaf spoke wise and fluent words. I remember that time when mead was flowing, how we pledged our loyalty to our lord in the hall, promised our ring giver we would be worth our price, make good the gift of the war gear, those swords and helmets, as and when his need required it. He picked us out from the army deliberately, honored us and judged us fit for his action, made me these lavish gifts, and all because he considered us the best of his arms-bearing thanes. And now, although he wanted this challenge to be one he'd face by himself alone, the shepherd of our land, a man unequaled in the quest for glory and the name for daring, now the day has come when this Lord we serve needs sound men to give him their support. Let us go to him, help our leader through the hot flame and dread of the fire. He is just, trying to rally them, saying, we were picked for this. This is our job. This is our duty. The little scourge up at the beginning, I remember that time when mead was flowing, when everybody's drinking, everybody's got lots of courage, and now things are getting real, and you're all flying away. You get a sense of that critique in certain other instances. Grendel only shows up when everybody's drinking. It's a I don't want to push too far into this because the drinking was a real convention of that warrior culture, that very macho warrior culture, where drinking was what brought them together. The hall was conceivably mainly a drinking hall, a place to go and drink together, and so it served that function. But there's also an undercurrent in all of this that sometimes the effect it goes beyond boundaries, that drinking to excess leads to outsized behavior, leads to aggressive behavior, leads people to leave their wits behind them and do stuff they should not do. And here you see this because he is criticizing once again the whole notion of drinking, it seems to me. Not exclusively, but there's that element there. The Wiglaf runs in with him. The two of them are now fighting the dragon. I don't want to get into that. 680. Beowulf's sword snaps. He is obviously very vulnerable at this point. Wiglaf runs in. They're both sitting there for taking on the dragon as the dragon's breathing fire all over them. They're hiding under the same shield. You get a sense of like the closeness of the battle and how they're at least sharing it. But the dragon lashes at the two of them, gets and actually bites Beowulf and mortally wounds him. But next thing they say, the noble son of Weohstan, Wiglaf, saw the king in danger at his side and displayed his inborn bravery and strength. He left the head alone. He had been sort of hacking at the dragon's head, but his fighting hand was burned when he came down to his kinsman's aid. He lunged at the enemy lower down, so that his decorated sword sank into its belly and the flames grew weaker. He seems to strike a significant blow there. And it's interesting the way this is described, because you have this, he lunged at the enemy lower down. Now, it's a little unclear lower down than whom. It could be lower down than he had been striking when he was hitting the head, but the way it is written, it's uncertain, and it could also be lower down than perhaps Beowulf was hacking away with. So maybe Wiglaf's aim was better. Maybe he is a more skilled fighter because of his youth. It's a little uncertain there, a little unstable. And just the comparison also with what exactly follows. Once again, the king gathered his strength and drew a stabbing knife he carried on his belt, sharpened for battle. He stuck it deep in the dragon's flank. Beowulf dealt it a deadly blow. Well, did he? A knife? Wiglaf is hacking away with a sword and seems to have, struck a significant wound to the belly. And then Beowulf just, drives something into his side with a knife, which I don't know the weaponry that well, but how long can a knife be? A knife is probably not super long, so how deep is it going to go into what has been described as a fairly significant dragon's hide? The notion that, well, it's got to be the hero that strikes the blow here. Well, not exactly. It is clearly at least a shared effort between the two of them, where Wiglaf strikes a very serious, debilitating blow, a belly wound, which in anything is very likely to be fatal. But then Beowulf comes and just finishes them off. They had killed the enemy. Courage quelled his life. That pair of kinsmen, partners in nobility. So that line gives a significant sharing of credit. Partners, they, plural. And it is not even the two of them that get the full credit, but it is abstracted even more into the notion of courage quelled his life. Courage, the notion of courage which these two embody at this moment, was enough to stand up to this dragon. So you have this abstracted notion of courage, abstracted from the two of them, going up against the pure hatred and divisiveness and acquisitiveness, he's a hoarder, of the dragon, which is abstracted from the dragon itself. Those two forces collide, and it is the side of the good. Courage in general, mankind, humanity in general, mankind and humanity at its best in general, not necessarily just these two heroes. That gets the full credit. Had destroyed the foe, so every man should act, be at hand when needed. But now for the king, this would be the last of his many labors and triumphs in the world. So immediately it goes to that, so every man should act, pointing to this, the text pointing to this and saying, this is not just a story. This is a lesson. This is an example of what you should do, how you should behave, why you should pay attention to what we're saying here, because it will help you in later life. You need to emulate these behaviors. And Beowulf dies. He gazes out on, in his wisdom, the prince realized his state and studied and struggled toward a seat on the rampart. He steadied his gaze on those gigantic stones, saw how the earthwork was braced with arches built over columns. So he's seeing a combination of the works of man and the works of nature. The architecture built into this this cavern, essentially. He's dying, he's weak, he's bleeding. Wiglaf comes over and starts to bathe him. You get a sense of those the portraits of Christ down from the cross when his supporters are wiping away the blood from the wounds. And Beowulf recalls his reign as one of peace. He is a peace king. For 50 years I ruled this nation. No king of any neighboring clan would dare face me with troops. None had the power to intimidate me. This warrior culture, this hero of the warrior culture, is remembering himself and pressing his own case to be a king of peace. He commands Wiglaf to bring out the treasure that the dragon had hoarded. He says he is glad to leave my people so well endowed. He's going to leave and share this treasure with his people. Remember, he has no children. He's just referenced this and reminded everybody that I have no son on which to bestow any of this stuff, so I'm going to give it to everyone. Along with the warning that, it's up to you. He singles out Wiglaf, says, "You are the last of us, the only one left of the Wegmundings. Fate swept us away." Again, another culture. His tribe has been essentially eradicated. Sent my whole brave highborn clan to their final doom. Now I must follow them. A sense of nature, the natural sequence of life. That was the warrior's last word. He had no more to confide. He has given away everything at this point. The furious heat of the pyre would assail him. His soul fled from his breast to its destined place among the steadfast ones. Again, among the steadfast ones is an image of Valhalla, possibly, the pagan afterlife for warriors, but also a sense of an afterlife perhaps more generally Christian. In either way, it is a sense of communion. He is going to join other people. Communion means, outside of a religious sense, association, fellowship, a sharing, but it has a very specific principle in the Christian tradition of coming into communion with God. So I think it's working on all those levels there, where it's communion with God, also communion with his fellow people, and you can see those two themes interweaving as they go through. Wiglaf rebukes his fellow cowards. Anyone ready to admit the truth will surely realize that the Lord of Men who showered you with gifts and gave you armor you are standing in, when he would distribute helmets and mail shirts to men in the mead benches, a prince treating his thanes in hall to the best that he could find, far or near, was throwing weapons uselessly away. Because the value of the weapons is in what they mean, more than just their material reality. There's a sense of casting pearls before swine, another biblical reference there, where Wiglaf is disgusted at the 12, or the I'm not sure how many, I guess this would be 11. His associates who failed their hero in his time of need. Wiglaf commands that the story be reported. It breaks down to a story very simply of heroism and respect. Heroism on Beowulf's part, respect on Wiglaf's. He gives the story to a sort of a town crier, bard, and this person tells it to the public, so to speak. Now the people's pride and love, the Lord of the Geats is laid on his deathbed, brought down by the dragon's attack. Beside him lies the bane of his life, dead from knife wounds. That's the dragon. There is no way Beowulf can manage to get the better of the monster with the sword. Wiglaf sits at Beowulf's side, the son of Weohstan, the living warrior watching by the dead, keeping weary vigil, holding awake for the loved and the loathed. So you see the hero, the only room for the hero in this story is Beowulf. Wiglaf essentially writes himself out of it, because remember, it was more or less the two of them that brought down the dragon, and he's the only one around to tell the story. He could, by all rights, go and, if anything, just say, well, yeah, Beowulf died and I went and I killed the dragon. But he doesn't. And he casts Beowulf as the hero. The only credit for killing the dragon goes to Beowulf. And he is merely the one who is sort of watching and respecting this tradition. So it is a profoundly conservative position that he's in, where he is celebrating these warrior values, and he's doing so as a witness and as a kind of priest of it. They, at the very end, they keep together the burial mound for Beowulf, which was his instruction, and he makes it very clear that he wants it big enough at a certain point, right there where he's died. He wants it big enough for sailors to see, and that is brought up. That is made very explicit in a very specific sailor reference. And you can see, again, the values of this maritime culture, where they want to be able to see, they want a landmark. And when you are out at sea, especially presumably here in the days before buildings, it's very difficult to look at a stretch of land and see where you are and figure out your positioning. This was way before GPS. And so what sailors had was landmarks, early lighthouses, where they would know that, okay, there's a big hill that's going to be right around that corner, and that'll tell us how to find the harbor so that we can get home. Or perhaps warn us about rocks underneath or something like that. And the landmark is a very significant, real value for a maritime people. But I would say it's more than that, because that image of being a guide to people to bring them home, of being a symbol, something that they can look at and identify with the hero behind it, but also with their own path to get home. It's a frank Christian parallel. There's not a lot of other ways to see that. There is a great deal of religious pressure on these, on all of these little elements that are filtering down at the very end of the story, where you have this very pagan funeral, where they're piling up all of the treasure on Beowulf, and they're going to light him on fire, in essence, and then bury it all under this huge mound of dirt. And you can still see similar mounds throughout, like, points of England and Normandy, that, you know, some people have found great stuff in there. But the symbolism, I think, is quite explicit, and it plays out subtly throughout, and then it really sticks the landing in honestly the very last line. So the Geat people, his hearth companions, sorrowed for the Lord who had been laid low. They said that of all things, that of all the kings upon earth, he was the man most gracious and fair minded, kindest to his people, and keenest to win fame. Just think about that. Again, all the choices that this poet could have had to wrap this up, to describe Beowulf. Beowulf is a remarkably rich character to try and get at here. So why pick these two elements of that personality to try and bring out? Kindest to his people, keenest to win fame. Well, just think about the context of each of those. Kindest to his people, that's a Christian value. Kindness. A good servant, a good shepherd of the people. That is a Christian. That is Jesus' teaching put into action. But then connected to that so tightly was keenness to win fame. Fame is a pagan value. Fame is the pagan of the old Germanic tribes. It's the tribes of the old Roman Empire, to be perfectly honest, as well. It is all of that belief in a pagan world where your fame is your immortality, latched to Christianity. They are inseparable. In that last line, they're locked in uh, this lodestone that holds everything together, because it is about the interweaving of these two cultures, of these two traditions, these two belief systems, philosophies, civilizations, that this poem is finding its voice, trying to bring in the Christian elements, trying to maintain and find new room for and new applications for the pagan elements. You can't necessarily conquer the pagan with the Christian. It needs to grow more organically, which is exactly the point that the early Christians were approaching when they came to England, when in the time that this poem was produced. They were taking a largely pagan culture, an old Celtic culture, and trying to plant a Christian seed in it and see how it would grow up. They couldn't tamp down and stamp out paganism wholesale at the beginning. They needed to try and introduce this new element and see what would come of it. Perhaps over time it would overcome the Celtic, which has largely happened but not exclusively, or perhaps it would find a happy medium.